Today is the 29th of Tammuz and the 5th of August. Sorry. We're in chapter 12 of Shorish Mitzvah Satfila in Derech Mitzvah Sechas, in the Derech Mitzvah Secha from the Tzemach Tzedek. And I'm still debating about how much of what is in this chapter we'll do. And to translate it is very long and tedious and laborious. Every word is important, but the main point we said on Friday is that you can have this thing called trading places, achlifu duchtayu, as a form of making peace between two things when there's a higher illumination. And in this case, the higher illumination is the atzmus of Or Ein Sof, the essence, the very self of the infinite revelation of God. And that's what causes it. What he said was, what we finished with was that, in fact, the Alter Rebbe said both sides. He once said that the light is the light of loving kindness in the vessel of might, and he once said the first parsha, and he once said the opposite. And the opposite, he even brings us the whole bibliographic note here when it happened. It was Leil Shabbat Kodesh Parashat Noach Shnat Taf Kuf Samech. It's the fourth line from the top on page 240. Barichut beit yoto mishulchei Harav HaKadosh Reb Aaron Mitutia v'nechad HaBaal Shem Tov. The whole story here. It's a Kvod Dushat. It was an emissary there, a grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And then he spoke this mimer, and מה שכתב בסידור נ"ל, שאמר גם כן בפעם אחר. And the truth is that both are true, because there's a very important concept in the Arizal that between lights and vessels are names. And since we're dealing with the names can take on both sides. We're dealing with name of 42, name of 72, so it could take on either the side of the light or the side of the vessel. And so each time he explained it a little bit different. There's a statement from the Rashash that he's building on, but this is understood even without the Rashash inside the Arizal, that names are a intermediate stage between the light and the vessel, and he has an acronym called Kol Tzameh, all that are thirsty. It's a verse in, I think, Yirmiyahu, Kol Tzameh lechul hamayim. Everyone who's thirsty, go to water, meaning that if you're thirsty for God, go to Torah. And these first two words, Kol Tzameh, they're an acronym. They're the initials of Kelim, Levushim, Tzlamim, Mochin, Orot. It's a well-known acronym in the Rashash. It's not so known outside the Rashash. But what it turns out is that the Kelim and Orot, the vessels and lights, are the two extremes. And in the middle you have three levels of intermediates, which are called Levushim, Tzlamim, Mochin. Lamed, Tzadik, Mem. Which themselves are Tzelim. They themselves are Tzelim. Tzelim means like it's a very important word. We translate it as the image of God. The image, Tzelim. But really, the Alter Rebbe explains in length in the Likutei Torah that a Tzelim Elokim, what it means, what are Tzlamim in general, what are these images? So he says each day has its own image in the person. We talked about this, I spoke about this when we learned this with Yaakov a few years ago. And each Tzelim is a day. We get a certain number of images with which we live our lives. And each Tzelim is a Moichin. It's like the middle stage here. Tzlamim, Levushim, Mochin. So the middle stage of Mochin, it's like the thoughts that you have that day. So thoughts and language they're very close. So here he says that the names are a form of a tzelem. They're a form of an image. And you can think about it, it makes sense, because like when I call someone by, also people see this in their lives, that in one place they'll be known by one name, in another place they'll be known by another name. What is that all about? Why is it people have different names in different contexts? And the answer is because in each different place they reveal their mind differently. They're like a different person. So they have
secular name in your Hebrew name.
That might be one example.
Okay.
But usually it's more like with his close friends he has a nickname. With other people they call him more formally.
Yeah.
His mother calls him by a different name.
Gotcha.
So the mother doesn't appreciate so much the child's mind in the same way that people from the outside appreciate. The personality that comes out with your mother is different. Anyways, there's a lot to talk about names, and so that's what he says here. So he goes into a whole discussion now about the difference between yesh me'ayin, that we said there's 7 different levels of something from nothing, all the way down to ishtalshalus. Ishtalshalus means that cause and effect. Things are just coming one out of the other. Ilav ve'alul is another name for it in Hebrew. And he discusses the differences between the sfirot of their Ein Miyesh or and most importantly, how they descend in the order of creation of the world. So the short thing that we need to know from this is that every world descends from the world above it, from the sphere of Malchus, from the kingdom of the world above it. But there's a gap. There's always a gap. So even though within the worlds themselves, the sfirot come out of each other as a sort of cause and effect, between worlds there is a leap. There's a quantum leap, one could say. Like they're just leaping from one world to the next. So you have both things in every construct. Again, the easiest way is to explain it in a person's life, that there are periods of time when we feel that things are running along a certain track. They're like cause and effect. You move forward, you do the next thing. Life seems to have some kind of continuity to it. And then there are moments of gap, that you suddenly have a leap. And that's like when you move to a different world. So usually it's descent, sometimes it's ascent. The time that it's ascent for everyone is Shabbos evening. Like when Shabbos comes in, when Saturday comes in, Shabbat comes in, then the worlds leap up. They don't just, and you feel the sudden disconnect from everything. And therefore, the Zohar treats Friday night as very differently from Saturday morning. The 2 different Shabboses, it says. And in fact, that's how Chassidus explains, based on the Zohar, what it means that when the Jewish people keep 2 Shabbatot, then they'll receive a complete redemption. It says 2 Shabbatot in every Shabbat. Every Shabbat has 2 Shabbatot. Friday night is one Shabbos. Saturday morning is a completely different Shabbos. It's entirely different. Because Friday night there's a gap. You suddenly leap up to a different spiritual plane. Shabbat morning, you're already there. You wake up into it. It's a completely different feeling. It's much more continuous. There's a much more easygoing feeling on Shabbat morning than there is on Friday night.
I've heard of incarcerations where Jews who were addicted to cigarettes didn't know exactly when they would stop having a
Shabbat, Friday night. So there's always in life there are both of these. So now what he says is, let's give mamish to the end. Kuf Kaf Aleph at the end. Im kol ze, כשנעריך אותן לגבי האין סוף ברוך הוא עצמו, יימצא ששניהם שווים אצלו ממש יתברך. When we relate anything, and we spoke about this when we gave the parable of Earth from Andromeda to the Sun, from Andromeda to Earth, that as big as the distance is between us and the Sun, 8 light minutes, 8.5 light minutes, still, if you compare it to the distance to Andromeda, it's batal b'shisha. It doesn't exist. It's like nothing. So even if you take 2 things that are from different worlds and you compare them to the source, even though there's a gap between them and there's this whole skip and jump and leap and discontinuity, when you compare it to the real source, they're both like infinitely distant from it. And we feel that it's like yesh me'ayin. We feel that it's something from nothing. Right. If it's shtalshalus, it's not. It's the opposite of yesh me'ayin. It's continuous. Yesh me'ayin is a leap. Yesh me'ayin, something from nothing or being from nothing, is always a leap. So we have both of this. שהרי אינו ארוך לגבי החוכמה דאצילות כנ"ל, והחוכמה דאצילות אינה ארוך כלל לאור אין סוף. כמו כן ממש אין ארוך החוכמה דאצילות לאור אין סוף ממש, כמו שאין ארוך לו יתברך החוכמה דעשייה והשוואה אחת ממש. In any case, when we look at any level of chokhmah, of wisdom, we said the wisdom is always the beginning of every world. It's where the infinite revelation of Hashem begins to dwell in a world. So whenever a new world comes down, so even though the first thing that comes down is the crown, because it's like the thing that creates the leap together with the kingdom of the world above it, still where you begin to feel the continuity is in wisdom, but wisdom is still like infinite in some way. But the bottom point is not all these discussions, but rather that all the wisdoms in all the worlds, in whatever world you're dealing in, all the wisdoms are still infinitely distant from the source. As much as we say that the infinite dwells in the wisdom, it's still infinitely far away. Now, I was going to say something about this, and it escapes me for a second. What did I want to say about this? It was an important point, actually. Yes. So there's a famous saying, in Chabad there was a very big thinker who was a Talmud of the Alter Rebbe. His name was Zalman Zezmer. And unfortunately, we don't know much about him. We know that he was an incredible intellectual. And of all the people who the Alter Rebbe was close to, he always considered him to be the most brilliant. And Zalman Zezmer brought Rabbi Isaac of Homel into Chabad. He's famous for this. He used to go around different towns and he used to pick out people he thought that would be assets to Chabad. And he'd convince them to come. And Isaac of Homel is well known. From Zalman Zezmer we have bits and pieces, like a fragment here, a fragment there. It's like the pre-Socratics. It's like tiny fragments of his thoughts. And everything that he says is like, wow, a whole world. Like this sudden insight into what's going on in Kabbalah, what's going on in Chassidus. Like incredible insight that you also see has the benefit of maturity of years. Not that he was old. Maturity of years, I mean, like he's looking at it like from the perspective of 300 years later. He's like looking at the Alter Rebbe like he's 300 years later. He's seeing him in a very, very mature way. Like, what is he doing? What's going on here? This is important to know because, it takes hundreds of years for thought to develop to the point that the common person knows something about what's going on in the brilliant minds in the world. We have this problem, for instance, Kabbalah. Most people don't know Kabbalah, but Kabbalah is not that. If you were following what was going on, what the Arizal did was very revolutionary, but it's not like it's some kind of impenetrable fortress that nobody can understand. It's not like that. It's just that it takes time. It takes time to begin to understand it. It takes time to begin to understand this, that most of the problem is that it's disorganized. That if it was more organized, it would be very easy to study it. And most people, like Rav Ginsburg says many times, learning Kabbalah is a lot easier than learning Shas, than learning Talmud. Much easier. It's a construct. It's almost like looking at how to put an IKEA dresser together. It's that easy. It's just that it's disorganized. You see bits and pieces from everywhere. A lot of it has to do with how the Arizal talked, how he taught, and how he talked. A lot of it has to do with Rav Chaim Vital, his main student, how he wrote. And he realized it himself because he went through 3 iterations of the corpus of the Arizal's teachings, and he still wasn't content with what he had done, and he never published in his life because he thought it was still too disorganized. It was never published. So it went through many iterations of trying to organize. Even today, when you learn Otzros Chaim, which is probably the most organized of all, you can finish the book in about, 6-7 days. It's not something monumental. It's not too big. There's a lot of terms. There's a lot of technicalities. But once you understand what's going on, it's very simple. There's nothing so deep going on. thinking about what it means is very hard. That's what Chassidus does. But just understanding the construct is very easy. Anyway, so it takes years to be able to think about something. So Chassidus came along about 200 years after the Arizal. It took a long time to figure out, what do you do with this? Like, okay, so there's this beautiful construct that the Arizal made. What does it mean in the end? So that takes time. And the Reb Zalman had this ability to look at things as if he's 200, 300 years later and saying, okay, what does this actually mean? What does this do to you? And to do that for Kabbalah was pretty amazing that the Alter Rebbe did it. But he did it to the Alter Rebbe while the Alter Rebbe was still alive. He passed away before, he didn't pass away, he was executed by the Russians for doing circumcisions. Back then, if you did a circumcision for a non-Jew, not for a Jew, a person was converting. To convert was punishable by death, and he was killed by them. Anyway, he brought Reb Isaac, and Reb Isaac is brilliant, because Reb Isaac we have tons of writings, we have an incredible corpus. And you read it, and he's hard to understand. You have to really work. It's not like the Arizal. Here you have to work, because it's all about Chassidus. It's about, you have to unpack yourself in some way to begin to understand what in the world he's talking about. And his knowledge of science is excellent. I mean, he knew 19th century science in ways that I think most scientists didn't know back then. He understood optics. His main treatise, the most difficult one, is called Shnei HaMeorot, the two luminaries. He's talking about the sun and the moon. He understood optics in ways that we're only beginning to understand now. I don't know how. I don't know when he did this, how he did this. I don't know. He never says, but he discusses the sun and the moon and the different variations optically in ways that you're like astounded. And even trying to unpack it physically is very difficult, all the more so when you try to understand, so what does he mean that's going on in the soul? In any case, so Reb Isaac is unbelievable. It's very hard to understand. And there was a saying in Chabad that Reb Hillel repeats, Reb Hillel Faritz repeats, he says that the distance between, he says, don't think that the distance between Reb Isaac and Reb Zalman is the same as the distance between Reb Zalman and the Alter Rebbe. Okay? Don't think that they're the same. He says, the distance, or he used to say maybe about himself also, he used to say the distance between me and Reb Isaac is the same as the distance of my mind from Reb Zalman's mind. He says, the distance from my mind to Reb Isaac's mind is like the distance between, how did he say it? I'm trying to remember the exact phrase. He said they're both infinite, but to get the idea, I hope I'm quoting it right. It's a very important statement that he said. He said, the distance between my mind and Reb Zalman's and Reb Isaac's mind is like the difference between the mind of a cat and the mind of a human. And the distance between Reb Isaac's mind and Reb Zalman's mind is a completely, it's nothing like that. It's infinitely more. Like it's not between a cat and a human being. It's like you can't even understand. So that's the way of saying this in human terms, that there's an infinity which is really different. Rav Steinsaltz used to tell us that why Yerushalm, it's famous that Yerushalmers, people from Yerushalayim, can't be Chassidim. It's a famous thing. Everybody laughs at the people that grew up in Yerushalayim that they can't have a Rebbe. It doesn't work for them. The question is why? What's so special about Yerushalmim? So he used to say that the reason is very simple. He was born in Yerushalayim. He grew up in Yerushalayim. He knew everybody. He said, when you daven in the same shul with somebody that everybody says is the greatest sage of the generation, and you see him davening, and you see him year long, you go very accustomed to him. You become familiar. So even the greatest mountain looks to you like a little ridge. It's like a little hill.
They say the goodbye and the son and the brother-in-law can't be Chassid.
Right.
The same kind of.
Right. See, so somebody says there's a big Rebbe. He says, okay, I've seen big Rebbes. It's no big deal. But then he said, and he says, I came like that, with that attitude, to the Rebbe. And he says, suddenly I realized that there's an Everest. Not everything is small hills.
There's a what?
There's an Everest in the world. He says it was like an awakening for him.
Wow.
And this is Rav Steinsaltz.
He
was in his 20s.
He was still in his 20s. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
He was brilliant then. He was very brilliant, very sharp. I mean, one of the best minds that Yerushalayim ever put out. And suddenly he met the Rebbe and he said, it's an Everest. It's something completely different. It's nothing like the people I met in Yerushalayim. What?
Yes, there's a story of him, but he decided he's going to cut down.
Yeah, right. So, that's one of many stories.
Only the Rebbe can change it.
Yeah. It's true.
He used to say,
So, anyway, so with this we sort of have covered chapter 12. And B'ezrat Hashem we'll continue with chapter 13. So we said the main point of Achlifu Duchtai, the trading places thing. That once there's something higher, they can trade places, and that's really the answer that the Arizal gives, and Chassidus explains a little bit more this way.
I say all the time, everything is just right.
There are two ways that things come into our consciousness. There are things that are a leap into our consciousness, and there are things that are a cause and effect. That they seem to.
Everything is just right all the time.
Okay, so there the Alter Rebbe is talking about matter versus spirit. That matter is always something from nothing. Matter itself. He says in one place that there are two different orders of coming into being. There's the being from nothing, and there's being from being. Yesh miyesh. Yesh miyesh is ishtalshus. Spirit, he says, is always yesh miyesh. And then he says that in the Tanya. In the Tanya, he says that Hashem left all the spiritual worlds in order to want to dwell in our lowest of worlds, the physical world. And what he means to say there, which he explains in other places, is that spirit is always something from something. It's always continuous. There are levels of spirituality. But when it comes to creating physical matter, there has to be a leap. And so that is the biggest chiddush. For Hashem, that's the biggest novelty. That's the biggest novel thing that he did in creation. That there's a physical material world. And therefore he wants to dwell in the physical material world, because there it's a real leap from him, as it were. So in that sense, everything physical that we see is being from nothing.
All the time.
But the form that it takes, like why this continues to hold as a table the way it is something from something. Because a table is a slow form, slowly percolated form of a table from...
All the time.
Yeah. All the time it has to be Yesh Me'ayin, at every single moment. Okay, so we'll continue with B'ezrat Hashem tomorrow.